Hi, it's Katrina! A newly discovered shipwreck is baffling residents of a small Canadian town. The Earth is pulsing every 26 seconds and nobody knows why. And what in the world was discovered at the bottom of the deepest blue hole in the world? Today, we'll be taking a look at these mysteries and more, so let's go! The pulse. Maybe you can help solve one of the strangest seismic mysteries in the world. According to scientists, the Earth is making an unusual rumbling sound every 26 seconds. It's come to be known as the pulse of the Earth, but scientists don't know if it's caused by ocean waves, undersea volcanoes, or a force more daunting than you can imagine. The mystery began early in the 1960s. A brilliant researcher by the name of Jack Oliver documented the pulse and understood how unusual it was. Unfortunately for Jack and his colleagues, they didn't really have the tools necessary to understand the pulse. How can you understand the stars without a telescope? They had some instruments, but they weren't very advanced, not compared to the excellent instruments seismologists use today. Even with modern instruments, scientists can't figure out what the pulse is doing. Is it the Earth's heartbeat? All they know for sure is that the source of the pulse is somewhere underwater. There have been a lot of scientists investigating the phenomenon. And when you get a lot of people researching one thing, there end up being a lot of different theories. One of the more popular theories is that the continental shelf is acting as a wave break. Off the coast of the North American continental mass, the highest part of the continental plate drops suddenly. If there were no water here, it would be the edge of a cliff, plunging thousands of feet to the ground. Instead, it's the edge of an undersea cliff, plunging into a deep and spooky abyss that's undoubtedly full of weird creatures. Scientists think that when waves hit this part of the shelf every 26 seconds, it creates a pulse. Not everybody is on board though. Other researchers have blamed the Sao Tome volcano or other volcanoes near Japan. It's also been suggested the pulse has something to do with the sun's energy. What do you think about this bizarre phenomenon? Is the pulse of the Earth caused by a natural force, or is there something even stranger at work here? The Legend of Morau. There are rumors of a sea monster lurking in Falmouth Bay in Cornwall. The legendary sea monster's name is Morau, and it's been sighted for centuries. Many believe Morau comes and goes, stopping by the bay briefly to spook the locals. Maybe you don't believe in sea monsters, but many people do. There are way too many stories not to at least suspect a little bit that sea serpents existed, and maybe still exist. In 1903, Captain White had just returned from a trip to Dublin. He was in his tugboat, called Triton, when something appeared in the water 15 miles from Longship's lighthouse. The captain had been sailing these waters for 30 years. He had seen every manner of beast and storm imaginable, yet he couldn't explain what his eyes were seeing. The serpent that slithered through the water was 100 feet long. When the captain came across the monster, it appeared to be feasting on a shark. Then again, what else would a sea monster feast on if not for sharks and whales? They need to eat. In 1906, a man on the passenger liner St. Andrew witnessed a sea serpent while passing by Land's End. There were 3 people who confirmed the sighting. Years later, in 1926, 2 fishermen were trawling near Falmouth Bay when they discovered something that would change their lives forever. It would change your life too if you came face to face with it. As the fishermen tried to bring in their net, they struggled way more than they should have. After an hour of struggling and labored breathing, they finally got the net to the surface. But they nearly dropped it back into the water when they saw the irregular fish in their net, if you can even call it a fish. They described it as a monster about 20 feet long. It had a beak, 4 legs, and scales that the fishermen compared to armor. To make things even weirder, as if they could get weirder, the monster was covered in matted brown fur. What kind of sea serpent has fur like a bear? Nobody in modern times has found proof of Morau. Maybe the last one died in the 1920s. Maybe it never existed at all. All I know is that the sea serpent is alive and well in the legends of the Cornish coast. Wrecked in Canada. From the treacherous depths of the deep blue sea, a mystery has arrived on the shores of Canada. Locals were shocked to discover a shipwreck partially washed up on the beach. But it's not totally beached. Nobody's going to be running away with planks from the wreckage. It's still covered by several inches of water. The old boat was first spotted by Wanda Blackmore's son as he was out hunting sea ducks. It's not every day an enticing mystery like this ends up on Canada's doorstep. Naturally, locals in Newfoundland are thrilled. It's believed the wreckage could be from the 19th century. It may have been this very boat that brought locals' ancestors to the island, such as the ancestors of Wanda Blackmore, whose roots can be traced back to England, Ireland, and Scotland. It's the same story for many people who live in Atlantic Canada. The island of Newfoundland has strong ties to Ireland, as it was a popular destination for people fleeing during the potato famine. If you're from the East Coast and can trace your heritage back to the Old World, let me know all about it in the comments. I think that's pretty cool. So what to do with a mysterious wreck that appeared out of nowhere? Archaeologists say it's a race against time. First, they need to survey the wreckage, which is currently happening, and they have to be quick though, because at any moment, strong waves could drag the boat back into deeper waters. If that happens, the boat will be lost forever. One of the provincial archaeologists involved is Jamie Brake. Jamie said Newfoundland is an island with a big seafaring history. There are countless shipwrecks scattered just off the coast, especially near Cape Ray, where this newest one was found. There are only about 250 people in this rugged part of the Atlantic, but the hazardous rocks have claimed dozens of ships since the 1800s. And now for number 10, but first, it's shoutout time! I wanted to give a big thank you to Granny Grouch and Sasha from Persia for supporting this channel. Thanks so much for watching and spending time with us. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about mysterious discoveries. Lost Stone Age cities. There is a city that was constructed during the Stone Age, and then it was lost for thousands of years, only found recently by a team of explorers. However, the explorers have encountered some difficulty exploring the lost city. The problem is that it's currently underwater. You'd have a hard time exploring it too. The ancient ruins are submerged at the bottom of the Baltic Sea in northwestern Europe. Is this a city built by mer people? Could it have been an aquatic species of human who built the stone walls 6,000 years ago? It's a cool concept, but pretty unlikely. Researchers believe the city was built by human hands during the last major period of glaciation. That's a really fancy way of saying during the Ice Age between 15,000 and 6,000 years ago. It's crazy to think that some of the oldest ruins in the world are currently underwater. But that's the truth of it. Near the end of the Ice Age, things on our humble little planet started to change. The weather warmed, which was nice because cavemen and cave ladies could hang out at the beach and have barbecues. But it also meant the massive sheets of ice that covered much of North America were melting. This changed the landscape and human civilization. I'm going to take you on a trip now, a condensed history of early humans. Don't blink or you might miss it. 15,000 years ago, the latest calculations have the global sea level at about 330 feet lower than what it is right now. You know that lake close to your house? The one where people take their dogs in the summer? That lake didn't exist 15,000 years ago because all of its water was trapped in the ice. But when the ice began to melt and the temperature went up, the meltwater slowly formed your favorite lake. Prehistoric humans crawled out from their caves like bears out of hibernation and started building settlements along the edges of lakes and seas. After all, who doesn't want waterfront property? The prehistoric people had the right idea, but the ice wasn't done melting yet. The faucet was still on, increasing sea levels rapidly. This resulted in what may have been a prehistoric catastrophe. All the vacation homes built by Stone Age humans on the edges of lakes and along the coastline suddenly found themselves at the bottom of these lakes. It was like an economic crash, or maybe an economic sink. Just imagine house prices if the whole neighborhood is suddenly underwater. Fast forward to today, archaeologists are exploring coastal areas and finding the ruins of those very homes. The ancient ruins recently discovered at the bottom of the Baltic Sea are part of a lost landscape, a lost world that would be amazing to see with your own eyes. By exploring the ruins, experts can learn more about how people lived at the end of the Ice Age. Ancient fruit baskets. I have a special treat for you now, a basket of fruit that was made 2,200 years ago in ancient Egypt. The only catch is that the fruit isn't very edible. It sank in the ruins of Tanis Heraklion and was only found recently by underwater archaeologists. Talk about a glimpse into the everyday life of ancient Egyptians. The fruit basket still has fruit inside, showing exactly what someone might have packed on a mild summer's day to have a picnic. But the fruit basket is only one part of a much larger discovery, one that I love to tell people about. The city of Tanis Heraklion fell into the angry waves of the Mediterranean in the 2nd century BC. The once proud port was hit by earthquakes and tidal waves, Mother Nature's very own double whammy. Then the ground beneath the city liquefied and the whole place sank. It was not a good time for the people who lived in the city. The destruction must have been like something out of a movie. As the ground liquefied and the city started to sink, chaos and panic enveloped the Egyptians. Researchers know it was chaotic because of the remains they've uncovered. Remains such as boats and their cargo trapped underneath giant stones. As the city sank, humongous temples like you wouldn't believe cracked and fragmented. Their stone walls fell sideways, crushing boats that were docked in the harbor beside them. These boats are still trapped at the bottom of the Mediterranean, their cargo preserved in clay. The clay preserved everything that got stuck in it, sort of like the prehistoric animals in the La Brea tar pits. The fruit basket, which was uncovered by legendary researcher Frank Gaudio, the same man who found the city in the year 2000, was protected from the passage of time thanks to the clay. When Frank and his team found the basket, they were shocked to be holding someone's abandoned lunch. But was this really somebody's lunch? Or maybe they'd taken the fruit basket onto the ship to give as a gift to the captain. The basket could have been meant as an offering at one of the nearby temples. It's such a random object, but it must have had a heartfelt story behind it. Don't worry, I am going to tell you what fruit was in the basket. The fruit was dome, which comes from the African palm tree. The basket also contained grape seeds, which were all the rage in ancient Egypt. The trail of crabs. Scientists have found something in the water that has never been seen before, and it's all thanks to a trail of squat lobsters. Wait, squat lobsters? What are those? Their name is extremely misleading because they aren't lobsters. They're crabs. Gallifade crabs, to be exact. Scientists just call them squat lobsters, no idea why. While investigating the waters around the Galapagos Islands, researchers came across a dense population of these pale white crustaceans. Following the crustaceans led researchers to a hydrothermal vent field that nobody had ever seen before. The vent field is located on the boundary between two tectonic plates. 250 miles north of the Galapagos Islands, the Cocos and Nazca plates separate. Picture in your mind something like the Grand Canyon, but not so epic and filled with a lot more water. Where the plates separate is a margin home to a field of deep-sea vents. The field is about 98,000 square feet. Hydrothermal vents are unique places in the ocean. There are about 550 of them known in the world, but only half have ever been seen. The rest have been identified using temperature signatures deep in the water. Vent fields are easy to spot because they are hotter than the water surrounding them. Vents occur typically between two tectonic plates. When magma pushes to the surface, the water becomes heated by the magma, sucking minerals inward from the surrounding rocks. This creates a field of what looks like stone chimneys sprouting along the sea floor. The best thing about hydrothermal fields is that the rich concentration of minerals and the hot water attract all kinds of cool animals. If you're into weird sea life, I highly recommend doing more research after this video on hydrothermal vents. There are some hot vents that even attract certain kinds of shark. The sunken road. The Hvar was a unique culture in love with the sea. They lived in Croatia 7,000 years ago, and barely anyone has heard of them before. Lucky for you, I'm going to tell you all about this mysterious civilization, them and the artificial islands that they built out at sea. Let's start with the discovery of some new ruins, then into the astounding facts of the Hvar so you can impress your friends later. Igor Borzik from the archaeology department at the University of Zadar was investigating ancient sites on dry land. Then he noticed something strange in the Bay of Gradina. The unusual feature was about 15 feet deep. Because of the crystal clear waters of what is basically paradise, Igor could tell there was something important down there. Sure enough, it was a sunken road. A team of underwater experts dove into the bay and found a road that once connected the mainland of Korčula with a prehistoric settlement. The Hvar people settled on the islands and coasts of the Adriatic Sea 7 millennia ago. This was around the the same time that Stone Age people were building their cities in northwestern Europe, like I mentioned earlier. But the Hvar were different. Not only did they build settlements on the coastlines, but they also built artificial islands in the sea itself. It sounds a little unbelievable, but it wasn't that difficult to do. If you got enough friends together and found some rocks, you could build an artificial island of your own. The Hvar stacked rocks on top of each other in a body of water until they had made an island. They packed rocks and dirt and stones into huge underwater piles. With enough material, the piles soon breached the surface. The Hvar were able to do this with such skill that they created their own miniature towns on the water. To reach these towns from the shore, they built roads using the same method. The ruin of one of these roads is what Igor spotted in the Bay of Gradina. Underwater surveys revealed that the passage was made entirely of stacked stones, about 12 feet in width. At the other end is a submerged artificial island. All of the ruins are partially buried under layers of muck, and so are the artifacts. The dive team found stone axes and flint blades. They feel like pretty basic tools for a civilization who could make their own islands. I can't tell you the end of the Hvar people's story because I don't know it. They were an anomaly in the Stone Age because of their obsession with artificial islands. Scientists still don't know why they felt the need to make the islands. If you have any ideas, let me know. Then, when the sea levels started to rise and their islands were submerged, the Hvar disappeared from history. The lost continent of Sahl. A little bit earlier, I talked about how the sea level used to be significantly lower. What I failed to mention is that the period of low sea levels lasted for roughly 65,000 years in human history. During this time, Australia was connected to New Guinea. These days, you'd have to take a plane or a boat to get between the land masses. But if you lived in prehistory alongside epic beasts, you could have ridden a giant kangaroo or some sort of mutant koala bear. The landmass that connected Australia and New Guinea is currently underwater. It's a sunken archipelago that was once part of a giant continent known as Sahl. Sahl consisted of Australia, New Guinea, the Aru Islands, and Tasmania. Across the water was another supercontinent called Sunda, which is also partly underwater now. Sunda connected Borneo to Sumatra, Java to Malaysia, and essentially all of Southeast Asia. You could have walked from Saigon to Bali. Talk about an adventure! And at a time when the jungles were packed to the gills with crazy critters. This was a journey you could take until 12,000 years ago, when Sunda, along with Sahl, started sinking. A sunken merchant ship. One of the most awesome shipwrecks in Europe was a merchant vessel that sank in the 15th century. It's so famous in Sweden that it's basically the Titanic of the Stockholm archipelago. The boat sank 500 years ago in the Baltic Sea. It wasn't seen again by human eyes until the 1960s. Not only were the 1960s groovy, but they were also exciting times for archaeologists with access to newer and impressive technology. Although, to be honest, the technology wasn't that great, especially compared to now. The original divers who found the wreckage had to sketch the site from memory. They hadn't invented those cool underwater cameras you may have taken to the beach with you as a kid. It wouldn't be until the 2000s that divers were able to analyze the undersea wreckage more professionally. They confirmed a wooden hull covered in bricks, possibly bricks being the cargo. Still, it was the 2000s, and the technology wasn't quite where it needed to be. 2022 was the year everything started to come together for the Madeira wreck, as the experts call it. A team of researchers led by Nicholas Eriksson at Stockholm University took samples of the crash zone and documented all visible ship parts. They managed to learn that the medieval merchant vessel, the container ship of the Middle Ages, was 26 feet long. The trees that were cut down and turned into its wooden planks came from 1467. What was life like on a merchant vessel sailing the frigid Baltic waters 5 centuries ago? It must have been quite an adventure for the sailors on board, and quite perilous as well. Researchers discovered stone shots in the wreckage, suggesting the ship may have been armed with cannons when it sank. Cannons that fired rounded stone boulders. The bottom of the Great Blue Hole. There is a hole off the coast of Belize that is deeper than it has any right to be. It's called the Great Blue Hole, a name that couldn't possibly be more fitting. It's over 400 feet deep and utterly terrifying. It was also recently visited by divers, who braved its dark shaft with great courage. They reached the bottom of the hole and found something disturbing. Perhaps you've seen the Great Blue Hole before and not even known it. It's one of the most incredible natural features on the planet, so pictures of it are all over the place. It might even be the background on your computer screen right now and you didn't realize. The Blue Hole is approximately 60 miles from the edge of Belize. Divers have known about it for decades, but it's been impossible to explore the dangerous depths of the ocean pit. Humans may have gone to space, but getting a man or a woman to the bottom of the sea is still an incredibly difficult task. People will most likely be walking on Mars before they're walking at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. But technology is advancing, and it recently advanced enough for divers to reach the bottom of the Great Blue Hole. They were joined by none other than billionaire adventurer Richard Branson. Branson is the founder of Virgin Airlines. You know, the rich guy who keeps going on wacky adventures and funding incredible expeditions. When he learned that people would be diving to the bottom of the hole, he absolutely had to get in on it. Branson and diver Fabien Cousteau, of the famous Cousteau family, traveled deep into the hole using a small submersible like a private submarine to reach its unfathomable depths. What they found was a mixed bag of various horrors. I'm going to give you 3 options, and I want you to tell me which you think is the one that explorers discovered at the bottom of the hole. A plastic bottle, somebody's lost GoPro, or a human body. If you answered A, B, or C, or all of the above, you were correct. The team did find trash, which is a plastic bottle, and they did find a GoPro with photographs of somebody's vacation on it. They also discovered 2 bodies stuck near the bottom of the hole. They appeared to be the corpses of divers who went missing trying to explore the vast sunken catacombs. It's just another reminder of how dangerous exploring the ocean really is. There is another discovery that the team made at the bottom of the Blue Hole. They found caverns that are home to hanging stalactites. This was a major discovery with big implications. If you fancy yourself a bit of a geological nut, you'll know precisely why underwater stalactites are a big deal. Stalactites that hang from the ceiling of a cave do not form underwater. This means the Blue Hole used to be dry. Just like the cenotes of Mexico and Belize, the Blue Hole was once a vast cave that people were able to walk in. Prehistoric people may have even lived in this vast cavern before it was flooded. Richard Branson called the Blue Hole one of the starkest reminders of climate change danger he had ever seen. Something happened that caused the sea level to rise at least 300 feet. And quickly. Could this have been the flood mentioned in the Bible? Seafloor hoofprints. Hoofprints at the bottom of the sea sounds like a really terrible name for a rock album, or maybe the name of a B-level horror movie. But there are, in fact, in reality, hoof-shaped markings that were discovered at the bottom of the ocean. They are likely still there right now. The mysterious hoofprints were first seen in 2013 by scientists with New Zealand's National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research, or NIWA for short. The organization is New Zealand's version of America's NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Anyway, I'm not here to throw acronyms at you. I'm here to tell you that researchers found the weird hoofprints while surveying an undersea ridge. The prints are at a depth of around 1,400 feet. It's a logical guess to say the hoofprints weren't left by a seahorse since they don't have hooves. One of the marine biologists involved, Sadie Mills, revealed the incredible technology used by the NIWA. It's called the Deep Towed Imaging System, which allows scientists to view the sea floor in incredible detail. When the team was going over the footage they'd taken during the trip, they continued finding mysterious marks. 10 years have passed and scientists still haven't verified what's been leaving hoofprints at the bottom of the sea. But they do have a very reliable guess. The scientists aren't totally floundering, no pun intended. They believe the marks could be made by a deep-sea rat-tail fish, also known as a grenadier. The fish earned its bizarre name because of the fact it has a long, wispy tail like a rat's tail. It's not the cutest fish, but I've definitely seen scarier sea critters. Researchers finally realized what the marks were when they compared the hoofprints to the rat-tail fish's head. The shapes are an exact match. The fish most likely stuck its face into the dirt to eat something, like a kid bobbing for an apple. This action left a mark that looks identical to a hoofprint. Times that by a bunch, and you have a trail of hoofprints at the bottom of the sea. Artifacts from the HMS Arabus. If your favorite maritime disaster story is the loss of the HMS Arabus and the HMS Terror, you're going to love this next discovery. In 2023, a seasonal research trip done by Parks Canada found amazing artifacts from the world's worst failed expedition ever. The story of these ships is long enough that I could talk about it for hours, but at the risk of rambling the day away, let me give you the short, sweet, and spooky version. In 1848, Sir John Franklin led an expedition in search of the Northwest Passage. It would be his last adventure. The Terror, which is a terrible name for a ship by the way, was captained by Franklin. The Arabus was under the command of James Fitzjames. That's basically the same name twice. The travelers became stuck in the ice in the Victoria Strait, not far from King William Island. The crew held on as long as they could, hoping the ice would let them free of its cold grip. But after over a year, they couldn't take it anymore. In April of 1848, it was time to go. By the time the crews of the ships chose to leave, there were hardly any of them left. 24 men had died, including Sir John Franklin. The few survivors, following James Fitzjames, set out across the tundra on foot. They were hoping to find the mainland, but disappeared. They were never seen again, and the truth of their hardship was lost. Then, in 2014, Canadian archaeologists discovered the wreckage of the Arabus. It was the most exciting discovery since the Titanic. The boat was sitting about 33 feet deep in the Queen Maud Gulf. 2 years later, and at about twice the depth, the HMS Terror was found. This is all old news though, and as you know, we're trying to talk about new news. The 2023 seasonal research trip had archaeologists dive 68 times down to the wrecks. Scientists on the research vessel David Thompson were supported by an excavation barge. Divers focused on procuring personal items from the dead explorers. They spent a lot of time in the cabin of an officer they think was 2nd Lieutenant Henry Dundas Livescant. Archaeologists found a parallel ruler, a thermometer, a fishing rod, and a book with a leather cover. They also found the leather sole of a boot, some storage jars, and pharmaceutical bottles in the steward's pantry. Then they moved on to the cabin of 3rd Lieutenant James Fairholme, where they discovered a small collection of fossils that appear to have been collected by those on board. The discoveries will be preserved and analyzed this year by Canadian scientists. Hopefully, these legendary vessels will one day be brought to the surface. The Viking Sword. In northern Poland, workers were busy dredging the muddy riverbed of the Vistula River when they found an artifact of unimaginable power. Not just power, but prestige. Workers recovered a sword that I'm sure many people wouldn't mind having on display in their home. This sword is at least 1,000 years old and could have a connection to the Vikings. Poland isn't that far from the Norse lands, so it's no surprise that Vikings came here, and one of them might have lost their sword in a river. When the workers found the blade, they contacted the proper authorities. Archaeologists swooped in like capeless heroes and took the sword back to the laboratory. There, they bombarded it with X-rays, poked it, and most definitely prodded it. It turned out the sword raised from the river is one of very few Type S medieval swords. Wait, Type S? That can't be a real scientific classification. Type S is normally reserved for the top-tier weapons in video games. Apparently, archaeologists are using the same classification system now. What other artifacts do you think deserve to be Type S? Researchers in Poland believe the sword is one of only 170 found so far, most of them uncovered in Northern Europe. On the blade is an inscription that reads, Ulfbert. It's believed it was a person's name. Just like you might write your name on your lunch in the work fridge, this ancient warrior wrote his name on his deadly sword. Maybe he was called Ulfbert the Wise or Ulfbert the One-Tooth. Researchers think he came from Viking territory, but how his sword ended up in the river is still an unsolved mystery.
Thanks for watching! Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed.
Artifacts on the Titanic. The RMS Titanic sank on April 14, 1912, but the remains of the unsinkable ship that sank weren't found until 1985. These days, the Titanic is sitting peacefully on the floor of the ocean, just off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. Since it was discovered, researchers have been racing to bring as much as they can to the surface, and they have recovered some fascinating artifacts. 7 trips have been made to the ship, with over 5,500 artifacts recovered so far. One of them is an old violin that was allegedly played by Wallace Hartley as the ship went down. At a UK auction in 2013, the violin sold for a whopping $1.7 million. Another find is the bell from the crow's nest of the ship. It was recovered during the initial expedition in 1985. This bell was rung by the Titanic lookout Frederick Fleet to try and warn the captain that there was an iceberg ahead. Clearly, it wasn't enough. Underwater divers also found a menu listing the last meals that were served on the Titanic, which sold at auction for $83,000. They also recovered sheet music played by the musicians, a letter written on stationery right before the ship sank, and even a pocket watch owned by passenger John Chapman. This watch is literally frozen in time. Its hand stuck at 1:45 a.m. as the ship was being submerged underwater. An alligator purse belonging to a woman named Marion, meanwhile, preserved many of her documents from the ocean, including a marriage license and a receipt for a canary that was traveling with her. There were even vials of perfume that survived. Scientists broke down the recipe and recreated the scent, calling it Legacy 1912, in case you want to smell the perfume used by those over 100 years ago. The Yellow Brick Road. A very bizarre formation has been discovered deep underwater. Marine scientists on board the exploration vessel Nautilus were using a remotely operated vehicle to investigate underwater seamounts. These are mountains that formed underwater because of volcanic activity. They were looking at the underwater volcanoes around Hawaii, trying to figure out the origin of the thousands of potentially deadly submerged fiery mountains in this region of the Pacific. As they were conducting their scientific study, they came across something unexpected. Video footage from the expedition revealed a pattern of cracks on the ocean floor that look an awful lot like rectangular yellow bricks. What shocked the scientists most of all is that these bricks appeared to be perfectly straight, with perfect right angles. This is shocking because Mother Nature doesn't usually work in straight lines, especially at the bottom of the ocean. Everything tends to be random and shapeless. But this one small chunk of area appears to be paved in actual yellow bricks. People are now calling this the Yellow Brick Road to Atlantis, because in all honesty, it does look like a road that once wound through the undersea mountains beneath Hawaii. Nobody has found any trace of a lost city, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Scientists simply say the rock formation was caused by volcanic activity. But all of those straight lines have gotten people excited. If it's not the road to Atlantis, perhaps it goes to some other lost city consumed by the waves thousands of years ago. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Too many viruses. As if the ocean couldn't get any scarier, a new scientific study has found the undersea world is teeming with viruses. Researchers have just identified 5,500 totally new kinds of viruses that have never been seen before. The team, led by Professor of Microbiology Matthew Sullivan, found so many new kinds of RNA viruses, they were able to propose 5 new divisions of viruses. These RNA viruses are just like the West Nile virus and COVID-19, but this doesn't mean you need to panic. There are millions of viruses in the world, with only a handful able to infect human beings. Still, it's always alarming when thousands of new ones are discovered at once, because you just never know what kind of effects the next virus can bring. If you are wondering how scientists were able to identify all these viruses, they had to analyze 35,000 water samples from every ocean in the world. In the water samples are tiny bits of life called plankton, which are the carriers of these viruses. And it makes sense for there to be all these potentially deadly things hiding under the sea. After all, the scientists say all life on Earth came from the ocean, and that includes the pathogens and viruses that make us sick. There is no word now on if any of these viruses are dangerous. We'll just have to wait and see. World War I shipwreck. A shipwreck from World War I was recently uncovered deep in the depths of the Cornish Sea. It was found by divers, with a spooky sea monster guarding the wreckage and its cargo of over 10,000 submerged liquor bottles. It was professional diver Dominic Robinson who came across the shipwreck of the SS Liborn, which sank back in 1918. It was a British cargo ship that had been targeted by the German Navy in World War I. German naval officer Helmuth von Rockteschel gave the order to fire, and the ship was lost. Thousands of bottles of alcohol were submerged with it as it plunged into the murky depths. When it sank, it took thousands of bottles of booze down with it. During Dominic's dive, he found plenty of these bottles strewn about the wreckage, but there was also a lot more beneath the sand that he couldn't get to. It's so far from shore and so deep that it was difficult to find in the first place, and almost impossible to scavenge anything with just his 2 hands. As for the monster that was discovered guarding the shipwreck, it turned out to be an anglerfish. At least that was what it looked like. The thing was massive, estimated at 3 feet long and lording over the shipwreck like some kind of monstrous sentinel. It didn't give the diver any trouble, but it definitely added to the creepy atmosphere of the place. Shipwrecks with gold. In 2022, the Colombian Army shared new and shocking images of the legendary San Jose shipwreck. This famous ship has been hiding underwater for 300 years, known to contain the greatest sunken treasure in the entire world. This ship was carrying riches worth upwards of billions of dollars when it sank back in 1708. The San Jose galleon was a Spanish ship that was filled with 200 tons of gold, silver, and emeralds. As it was leaving Cartagena in Colombia to take the goods back to King Philip V of Spain, it was attacked by the British. It sank along with 600 crew members and its billions worth of treasure, sitting on the bottom of the ocean ever since. Despite the fact that the ship was discovered a number of years ago, no one has ever been able to recover the wealth. Colombia considers the wreckage to be in its territorial waters and part of its heritage. The Spanish want a piece, and so does the company that helped find it. For the time being, nothing can be removed. But that doesn't mean we can't look at it. The Colombian Army just did 4 observation missions using a remotely operated vehicle to see what kind of treasure really is down there. At 3,100 feet deep, they found a ton of it. Cannons covered in mud, cracked pieces of pottery and glass, and also gold pieces. There are so many gold pieces scattered across the sea floor, it's almost impossible to imagine just how much it's all worth. It's shout-out time! Big thank you to Leanne Farrell and Hampus S for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to join the Origins Explained family. Town swallowed by the sea. In the 13th century, there was a small English town called Ravensthorpe. It was a medieval port village located in what is now East Yorkshire. There weren't many people living there, only about 100 houses, but that was ample size for the medieval days. There was a wharf, warehouses built all along the seashore, and it was a truly bustling center for fishing boats and cargo ships. Taverns, churches, everything a person could need. By 1299, Ravensthorpe would have been considered a successful coastal town. But all that changed sometime in the middle of the 1300s. Scientists don't know exactly when, only that it was swept into the sea unexpectedly and never seen again. It's actually considered by those in the know to be the Atlantis of Britain. Scientists have been trying to track down this mysterious town for decades, but up until recently, all efforts were in vain. Finally, archaeologists found a group of rocks and busted stonework just a few feet underneath the surface off the coast of Yorkshire. There's pretty much nothing left except eroded rocks. Still, researchers like Professor Dan Parsons are convinced they have finally found Ravensthorpe, the great port city that fell into the sea 650 years ago. The Banana Blue Hole. A blue hole is defined as an underwater sinkhole. It's like a pit on land, only out at sea, and there are a lot of them scattered across Florida's Gulf. They come in all different shapes and sizes, but each one seems to be an ecological hotspot, filled with a diverse array of plants and animals. It was just recently that a team of scientists decided they would investigate one of these holes, called the Amberjack Hole, to see how special it is. They believe it formed about 10,000 years ago. It's about 265 feet deep, and it starts 425 feet below the surface. Only by deploying a submersible vehicle loaded with scientific equipment was the team able to reach its astounding depths. What the scientists discovered, according to Dr. Emily Hall, is that the Amberjack Hole is a hotspot for nutrients which fertilize the red tide. These nutrients actually work to supply the entire food chain of the world. Chemically speaking, the inside of a blue hole is different from the rest of the ocean. However, scientists don't really know why. There seems to be something about a sinkhole that makes it a kind of paradise for underwater organisms. And it's these organisms that supply the nutrients that leak into the red tide, which go on to spread themselves around the globe. This discovery has led to more questions than answers, and scientists are looking forward to doing some more exploring. Ccar Cavern. There is only one place in the entire world where cave paintings of prehistoric marine life can be found. Oddly enough, the only way to behold these fantastic ancient scribblings is by diving to the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea and then surfacing inside of an underwater cavern. It's called Ccar Cavern, and it's one of the most interesting marine archaeological sites on the planet. In fact, 3 men lost their lives just trying to find the underwater cave. Ccar Cavern isn't too far away from Lascaux Cave, where Picasso himself visited back in 1940. He was one of very few to ever behold the unbelievable artwork left behind by our prehistoric ancestors over 30,000 years ago. But it was the archaeologist Luc Van Rel who found the Ccar Cavern 3 decades ago. He came to the surface in that watery cave and gasped in surprise. Not only are the walls covered in seemingly miraculous paintings of aquatic life, over 600 images, but the place was also found to be teeming with artifacts from the Stone Age, things like prehistoric tools. It's nearly 10 miles from the coast and was populated by human beings during a time when the sea was over 300 feet lower than it is today. Sunken royal warship. A royal warship that was destroyed off the coast of Britain 300 years ago has just been unveiled by researchers. It was originally discovered almost 20 years ago, but in order to prevent anyone from trying to find it and damaging it, the scientists kept the debris a complete secret. The ship dates back to 1682 and had actually been carrying King James II of England when it sank, although at that time he was known as the Duke of York. Historical records show that he miraculously escaped the sinking of the HMS Gloucester after it hit a sandbar and went down like a bag of rocks. Claire Jowett from the University of East Anglia called it an outstanding example of underwater heritage. It's 28 miles from the coast and was discovered to be rich in historical artifacts. Things like navigational equipment, clothing, and the personal belongings of those who had needed to flee so quickly they couldn't take anything with them. But by far the coolest artifact of all is a glass bottle bearing the seal of the Legend family. The Leges were the original ancestors of the first president of the US, George Washington. Underwater Temple Garden. The Underwater Temple Garden is one of the most unique dive sites in the world, a literal underwater garden that can be found in Bali, Indonesia. While there are plenty of artificial dive sites all around the world that use monuments and sculptures as decoration, this one actually contains a real Balinese Hindu temple. Even though the temple is not that ancient, it's a pretty wild thing to see sitting on the bottom of the ocean. The underwater garden opened in 2005 and contains all legit Balinese architecture, from the main gate that had to be transported piece by piece and erected on the sea floor, to the sandstone sculptures of Ganesha and other Hindu deities. Unfortunately, this is not a place where casual divers can hang out. The main bulk of the site is located nearly 100 feet under the surface. This means you need some real experience if you're going to be checking out the sunken temple. And even though it's only been around for 20 years, most of the statues and architecture have already been completely overrun by marine life. In another decade, the statues won't even be recognizable because they will all be covered in so many tiny organisms and underwater plants. It really makes you appreciate just how quickly something like an entire city can fade to nothing when under the water.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed.
Yorkshire's Lost Atlantic. There is a lost city somewhere off the coast of England that archaeologists call Yorkshire's Atlantis. It's a fabled medieval town whose real name was Raven Sur Aud, but nobody knew where it was for over 650 years. 1,500 years ago, give or take a few centuries, Raven Sur Aud was a prosperous port town built on a sandbank where the coast meets the river. But a storm in 1362 caused water levels to rise, and the flood swept people's homes away. The survivors had no choice but to retreat inland. Ever since, the foundations of the town have been hiding underwater. And although we don't technically know where it is, we know it's down there somewhere. Professor Daniel Parsons at the University of Hull has taken an almost obsessive interest in the lost town and is currently trying to find it. The professor believes the remnants of the town are sitting on the seabed, and they have actually been seen several times at low tide by commercial lobster fishermen. He raised enough money for a research project, but after searching an area of almost 25 acres, they found no evidence of the lost city. They will do a second survey in 2022, and the researchers hope that this time they'll discover the mystery of the sunken city. They are also hoping to prove a point about how quickly climate change can destroy a coastal town. Hope you don't live too close to the water. Underwater cannibals. Scientists have discovered a shocking group of underwater cannibals. I'm not talking about mermaids that eat each other or some weird tribe of aquatic humans with a hunger for human flesh. No, researchers discovered teeny tiny sea creatures that have a predilection for eating their own siblings to bolster their own survival. The animals are baby sea stars, and although they look innocent and harmless, they cannibalize each other no problem. A pair of researchers discovered the behavior by accident while observing baby Forbes sea stars. At first, they were trying to find out how these small sea creatures would react when introduced to killer crabs in a lab. But Professor John Allen instead watched in disbelief as the baby sea stars began eating one another. John hadn't even put the crabs in yet. They had to scrap the whole experiment and study something new altogether. It was pretty disturbing. We can find these sea stars on the east coast of the United States, with adults growing to around 9 inches long. But baby stars are only about the size of a pinhead. An adult female sea star can lay between 5 and 10 million eggs a year. They undergo a process of metamorphosis in which they gradually transform from their tiny selves into their adult selves, just like how caterpillars turn into butterflies. But in order to store up enough energy to do this, the sea stars need a lot of food, and there's a lot of competition. If that food is not around, they'll settle for eating their brothers and sisters. The Terror. In the year 1845, the great Sir John Franklin led the most famous expedition in Arctic history. 2 ships sailed away from Britain, the HMS Terror and the HMS Arabus. They were searching for a way through the Northwest Passage to link Europe with Asia. During this time, there was a race to see who could find a faster way to get to Asia to be able to trade. The first person to do this would have made a fortune. But Sir Franklin and his crew of 128 men would never make it. The ships got stuck near King William Island, and every one of them met a tragic and often painful death. In the 1980s, expedition members in Canada found the mummified remains of some of the crew frozen in ice, as well as evidence they had died from cold and hunger, lead poisoning from eating canned food, and cannibalism. Some had gotten so hungry, they were resorting to eating each other. Then, years later, in 2014, scientists finally found the wreckage of the HMS Arabus in Arctic water near King William Island, kind of where everyone thought it would be. 2 years later, they discovered the HMS Terror not far away. The boats are still sitting underwater, looking exactly the same as they did nearly 200 years ago when they first got stuck. The ships have yet to be salvaged. Even though they've been inspected using remotely operated underwater vehicles, there is no way to bring these enormous vessels to the surface and get them to a museum. The only thing they have recovered so far is the ship's bell from the HMS Arabus. The UK has conceded the rights to the shipwreck to Canada, so it's up to them what they decide to do in the future. Sunken temple. Thailand is currently experiencing one of the worst droughts in history. The drought has been going on for about 10 years, and while it's devastating for the people, it has led to a rather unexpected discovery. A sunken Buddhist temple recently re-emerged from its watery prison, attracting local tourists who decorate the temple's broken statues with flowers and kneel to pray. The temple, along with the surrounding village, was all lost underwater in 1999 when the Thai government constructed a new dam. It's called Wat Nong Bua Yai Temple, and it was once famous for its massive Buddha statue over 13 feet tall. As of right now, the statue is missing its head, but there are other pieces of the temple still standing, like its huge gateway arch, a gateway to a riverbed, and some old pieces of stone. Before they flooded the temple, it was a meeting place for people from several surrounding villages. People would come just to hang out, take part in rituals, and celebrate during traditional festivals. Now, 20 years later, The temple is coming back to life. Ice Age carnivores. In an underwater cave in Mexico, scientists recently discovered fossils of animals that have been extinct for thousands of years. One of these creatures is an ancient wolf-like coyote, something previously believed to have only lived in South America. Researchers also found the bones of short-faced bears, which was a surprise because everyone thought they hadn't gotten that far north during the Ice Age. Scientists now believe these animals, and likely many other species just as ancient, originated in North America, slowly migrated to South America through Panama, and then migrated back up again just before they went extinct. Researchers also found the complete skeleton of a man from 12,000 years ago. They found it along with the skeletons of these extinct Ice Age carnivores, suggesting they had lived during the same period. Thousands of years before the Inca, the Maya, and the Olmec, primitive human beings were living alongside gigantic wolves and fierce bears. Judging by all their bones in the same cave, they were fighting over subterranean real estate. Scientists made the discovery in Quintana Roo, in an underwater cave called Hoyo Negro, or the Black Hole. Other animals found inside this dark and watery hole in the ground include saber-toothed cats and enormous elephant-like beasts that once roamed Mexico but are now long extinct. Want to give a big shout out to Dat White Chocolate and Peter Make It Happen. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe for more videos about amazing discoveries. An ancient whaling ship. In the year 1836, a whaling ship encountered a storm while moving through the Gulf of Mexico. It was a huge brig, but it didn't stand a chance against the raging winds and massive waves. The mast broke, the ship sank, and it settled at the bottom of the ocean. 207 years later, researchers discovered the remains of this ship, and scientists with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration were able to identify them. NOAA reported that their ship, the Okeanos Explorer, used a remotely operated vehicle to dive 6,000 feet beneath the surface of the ocean and inspect the mysterious wreckage. They could identify the ship as a two-masted wooden brig used for hunting sperm whales called Industry. It was built in 1815 in Massachusetts. Historical records show the crew was rescued, and salvagers took the whale oil off the ship before it completely sank. There isn't much of the ship left to see. There is an old anchor resting in the mud at the bottom of the ocean, some random pieces of debris, and the rest of the ship long since either decayed or was buried under sediment. Underwater treasure of Caesarea. Maritime archaeologists uncovered a bunch of precious artifacts in an ancient harbor in Israel. The divers were with the Israel Antiquities Authority's Marine Archaeology Unit and had been in the area doing a routine survey. The area was once part of the harbor of Caesarea, an ancient port city established in the 4th century BC. King Herod chose it to be one of the most important ports in the kingdom. It remained an important port city through the days of the Romans and into the Byzantine era. It was the last city in the Holy Land to fall to the Arabs during the Muslim conquest of the 7th century. After that, the city degraded until it left nothing but a small village. The marine archaeologists first came across a broken metal anchor and then the remains of two ships. At first they thought they were from the same time period, but that wasn't the case. One had wrecked in the 3rd century, the other in the 14th century. That's about 1,000 years apart. And each ship had spilled its own unique treasure into the water. Silver and bronze coins from the Roman period, bronze bells, an eagle figurine, statues of dancers wearing masks, and even a precious gemstone carved with a lyre. But by far the most impressive artifact is a gold ring with a green stone embedded in it. The stone depicts a young shepherd wrapped in a tunic and carrying a lamb on his shoulders. Researchers believe the figure is supposed to depict Jesus. It's a one-of-a-kind artifact, unlike anything previously found anywhere else in the world. Ancient sunken castle. At the bottom of a lake in Turkey, there lies the ruin of a 3,000-year-old Armenian castle. It's an ancient fortification that was found at the bottom of Lake Van, the biggest lake in all of Turkey. An Iron Age civilization originally built the castle called the Kingdom of Van. The lake is just as mysterious, likely created by the volcanic eruption of Mount Nemrut tens of thousands of years before. How in the world did the Iron Age civilization build a castle under the water? Well, they didn't. Of course, there was no water in the crater 3,000 years ago. The current water level is now hundreds of feet higher than it used to be, and it's now used as a reservoir. Believe it or not, it took a team of researchers over 10 years to locate the castle. Local legends and stories about the castle were passed down through the ages, describing a great fortress at the bottom of the lake, but nobody knew if the stories were true. The research team discovered corals, underwater critters, and even a sunken Russian ship, but never the castle, not for nearly a decade. Now they've identified its walls, along with the outlying settlement and the houses of the villagers who once lived in the castle's shadow. Pretty exciting stuff. Underwater potato garden. Archaeologists in Canada have discovered an underwater potato garden. That might not exactly be news, if not for the fact that the garden is 3,800 years old. That makes it the oldest example of a garden anywhere in the Pacific Northwest. The scientists discovered the remains of this mysterious garden east of Vancouver, hidden beneath a natural wetland. Researchers identified roughly 120 square feet of interlinked stone, creating something like a layer of pavement. They also discovered crude digging tools submerged in the marsh. And finally, they found over 4,000 wapato tubers, a type of edible plant very similar to the potato. The garden was most likely left behind by the First Nations people known as the Tsaktse. They likely planted the garden when nature had flooded the land like it is today. It was still a wetland, but there were dry spots for gardening. All the moisture allowed them to grow what they refer to as swamp potatoes. It's amazing because even though the tubers don't exactly look appetizing, they were probably the major crop of the garden, a legitimate garden farmed by people over 3,500 years before Europeans ever arrived in America. Underwater mystery blob. An underwater blob the size of an elephant mystified divers off the Mediterranean coast of Turkey. The divers, also underwater photographers, were taking pictures of the wildlife when, from out of nowhere, the blob appeared before them. It looked like a giant jellyfish, a transparent sphere floating 72 feet beneath the surface of the water. Amazingly, the blob sparkled as if it was covered in glitter, and yet the divers could shine their flashlights directly through its outer membrane. The underwater photographers were no strangers to weird marine life, and yet they did not know what this gigantic blob was doing, floating so close to them. All they could do was take pictures, try not to touch it, and figure it out later. Turns out the enormous blob wasn't a creature at all, but a mass of squid eggs. This is according to Michael Vecchione, director of the NOAA National Systematics Laboratory. He's also a curator of cephalopods at the Natural Museum of Natural History, so he knows what he's talking about. Michael says the divers are lucky that they got so close to an egg mass. Normally, we can only find them in open water far from the coast. These giant blobs contain tens of thousands of eggs, all suspended in a jelly mass. As that mass mixes with seawater, it gets bigger and bigger until the baby squids finally emerge from their eggs. Thanks for watching! What's your favorite underwater mystery? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!